Hey, my name is Pensky McCormack, and I'm the Assistant Registrar of the Parker Collection of Russian Art at the Georgia Museum of Art. This collection is the collection of Bill Parker, who started extending loans to us in 2014, but it's been building every year since. And as of now, they are on extended loan for us for the foreseeable future and are ours to exhibit. And as far as what the collection usually is focused on, it's on Imperial Russian art, or in terms of the title of the royal family, All Russia, which ended after the Bolshevik Revolution. So a lot of the stuff includes the belongings of the courts of Alexander III and Nicholas II, who was the last Tsar, including some of the stuff that belonged to the royal family itself. So this cabinet contains our larger objects and includes everything from hats and helmets to china and swords to some statuettes and a few more interesting and particular pieces that I'd like to highlight. So up here we have some of our historic costumes. Up here is the Chamberlain's coat, which is very heavy. It's embroidered with metallic thread. And to go along with it, we have the Chamberlain's hat, which I can show you in a moment, and the Chamberlain's key, as well as the Chamberlain's sword. And these were all from the Chamberlain for the court of Nicholas II. We have icons in the collection that go back to about the 1300s, and that's just what's been confirmed. But this is actually a modern icon. It was done by Dmitry Shkolnik, I hope I didn't butcher that, who is a contemporary icon painter out in California. This is a painting done specifically for our exhibition, The Reluctant Autocrat, which focused on the life of Nicholas II. This is Saint Alexei Tsarevich, the Passion Bearer. He was canonized after his death, as was the rest of the family. And we have many pictures. We have a box full of photographs, and this is a photograph of some of the family. It's all of the children and some of their closer friends, including Alexei. And then this vest up here, we haven't confirmed this, but is said to have belonged to Alexei. It's a child's vest with more metallic thread. This is our Chamberlain's hat. It is stored, like all the objects, in archival materials. That's acid-free, that doesn't off-gas or give off any kind of fumes that could damage the object. That's good because historic textiles are very, very fragile. In fact, whenever we had the Reluctant Autocrat, which is when this was last exhibited, our costume conservator had to travel here from Alabama to put the costumes on and off of the mannequins because it is such a delicate process. So because I like to hold it by the stand that it's already in, just because taking it off is a little nerve-wracking, even though this one is relatively stable. And it has been stabilized by the costume conservator, including some cracks along here where it's been reinforced with leather. When this came to us, it actually didn't have nearly any ostrich feathers left, which is what these are. They're kind of patchy, they're very, very short. There are some places that didn't have any at all. They only came up to about here, and of course they were yellowed by time. So part of the conservation, which this is not always the case, the idea with conservation nowadays is that you want to maintain as much of the artist's or craftsman's original work as possible and really not deviate from that. You don't want to necessarily get it back to looking like what it was, because that can mean that you damage or somehow add your own work on top of it in an irreversible way. That being said, there is some wiggle room in terms of, there's some wiggle room around that, and people ultimately make the decision that they think is best for the object's showing an interpretation and the life of the object. So this one did have ostrich feathers put on by the conservator, and in order to make that decision, we went through old documentation of similar outfits and what would have been worn at the time to make sure that we were making the correct stylistic choice for the hat. The hat also has metallic thread, including silver thread up here, and silver does tarnish. So this was cleaned at the conservator's studio, but because it's thread and because it's attached to cloth, it wasn't cleaned the way that we would usually clean silver, because that would involve residue of the silver cleaner getting into the hat in a way that we couldn't really get out. So whenever I talk about cleaning silver and about silver tarnish, what tarnish is a thin layer where the silver molecules have interacted with the molecules in the air and created a silver oxide, which is what tarnish is. And it's a layer of dark, kind of granular material, but you can't see the grain. It's just that very fine layer across the surface of the silver. And the problem with cleaning it is it does actually remove a layer of the material from the object. So you try not to do it too often, and after you do a cleaning, you need to wrap it in silver cloth, and then, because silver cloth can get used up, seal it with as little air as possible inside of a small bag. And some objects, it's better to keep silver on them, especially particularly detailed objects, because the layer of tarnish in the recesses can help you make out details that you might not be able to earlier. This is a case where that's not necessarily true, and it really doesn't have much tarnish on it, but I just wanted to use it to walk you through how we do clean off tarnish. So ordinary silver polish or polishing cloths are pretty damaging, honestly. You want to avoid polishing it too often, not only because it removes a layer, but because by hand polishing you are putting something abrasive onto the surface. In order to remove the tarnish, you have to rub it away. And the finest grade that you can use to do that to polish is actually calcium carbonate mixed with deionized water, which I have here. And calcium carbonate, I think this is pretty funny, it's actually the same stuff that's in Tums, only this is obviously a very fine grain. So what you need to do is first clean it off with a layer of acetone, which I've already done, and then you can move on to, a small amount of the slurry of calcium carbonate and water, and then you just move in small circles across the surface. However, no matter how fine of grain this is, you are creating very, very small, invisible to the naked eye, but very, very small, nonetheless, scratches across the surface. And depending on what technique and who in particular does the polishing, you can get different patterns of scratches across the surface, which is pretty interesting. You kind of see the history of who's touched it and how over time. And after you clean a patch, you can wipe it off with deionized water, and then a dry cotton swab. This is just cotton wrapped around a bamboo skewer, and I can control how big or small it is. Dry that off, and then on top of that, you clean off one more time with another layer of acetone, because acetone evaporates very, very quickly, and water does not, and can damage the object if it's left sitting on it. So acetone mixes with the water that's remaining and helps it dry off faster, so you don't have any problems. So it's kind of hard to see, but there's a small shine difference between the patch that I cleaned and the patch that I didn't. And especially up here around the letters, you don't necessarily see dark tarnish, but you do see some matte. I don't know if you can see it. About 530 something jetons, and they're all about this big. And you can usually tell a jeton both by its size and by the fact that it has a small loop on it, whereas badges, which we have about the same amount of, are kind of roughly twice as big and are pinned or fastened onto the clothing in a different way. It's usually, in some cases it's a military honors, in some ways it's like a club thing, like, or an organization, or maybe an award. We have several that are awards for graduates of a veterinary program, things like that. So one case in which you wouldn't want to tarnish. So the reason I'm handling this with gloves is because there are oils on your fingers, and it's never good to touch any object without both clean hands and gloved hands. But silver in particular, if you get your fingerprint on it, that oil will cause the metal to tarnish faster. And there are a few objects that we can see fingerprints on from people who have touched them over time, and it tarnished in the shape of their fingerprint. Now that's important because this is one object that was donated to us recently that we don't want to clean because it was the pen holder used by Nicholas II at the ceremony of the completion of the Narval, which is a Russian submarine completed in 1916. And this, in Russian, it has Narval engraved on it, which, it's kind of hard to tell. And it also has on it niello, which is a black decoration on silver. Sometimes there's also gold, and ordinarily we would clean this because you can see there's some green accretion here. It's just gray. You don't really get to see that lovely decoration as much. However, because this pen was used supposedly by Nicholas II, in theory, it had his fingerprints on it, and those fingerprints darkened over time and were tarnished and, in a way, etched into the surface of the object. And according to one of its past owners, it hasn't been cleaned since. So in theory, we have Nicholas II's fingerprints etched into the object, and we don't want to clean that, at least until we can make further decisions regarding it. Okay, so these are 3 more cabinets that hold objects of the Parker collection, as well as some other objects that came to us for the Reluctant Autocrat and Gibson Prayers, which were both exhibitions that were put up based around the Parker collection, but with some elaborative pieces. These drawers help us just keep things as organized and in as tight a space as possible, because in a museum, storage is always hard to come by. So we have a lot of different kinds in here. These are not ours. These are icons that were lent to us for a period of time. Here are some small daggers of different kinds. This is the niello. This is a dagger with niello that I was actually able to clean on the silver portions. Over here are the drawers with the jetons, and I don't know if you can see, but they are stored 2 by 2 because they are so small, and there must be more than 500. I honestly don't know how many we have, because there's also this drawer, and this drawer, and this drawer, and then there's about 20 or 30 more here that went out on exhibition and are currently in crates waiting to be unpacked. But we have all these in boxes now, but whenever they came to us, they were in individual baggies and were in no particular order because we hadn't written their accession numbers on them yet. So just picture all these drawers just with these out of boxes and like mixed up. And so that's part of my job, is to go through these objects, take them out of their original baggies, wrap them in silver cloth, put them into new bags, and get them in these archival boxes so that they can be more easily found, so that they can be kept from shuffling around, ultimately be kept safer, and also be easier for us to access. And a lot of the jetons have gilt on them or are made of gold. A lot of them are made of silver. Some are made of brass. A lot of them have enamel on them. Badges are designed the same way. Sometimes they have slightly higher significance than the jetons do. And we have not as many as we do of the jetons, but we still have quite a bit. These I've been working my way through cleaning because they're a little bit easier to clean than jetons. Jetons are so small, and you want to try to avoid touching anything that you don't know for a fact what it is, because what we clean this with is what we clean silver with is acetone. Acetone will dissolve a lot of kinds of paint. It won't dissolve enamel, but whenever enamel is damaged, we call it a loss, and sometimes it's painted in as a fill, and that can be dissolved. And if you're not careful what you're touching, if you don't know exactly what you're doing, you can end up with a slightly damaged object. Let me see if there's anything here. Okay. And then down here, so really glad we had the space for this. We have objects that just recently came to us in February. These are objects that once were in the collection of Vladimir von Zurikov, who is both a professor and a ordained priest in the Russian Church, Russian Orthodox Church. And these objects are mostly icons that would have been still used in Imperial Russia, which is what most of the collection is focused on, but they actually date back to much earlier than that. Some of them are in the 1300s, and you can kind of tell. So these are Old Believer crosses, which stick to the Russian Orthodoxy and their practices very strictly. And there is a bit of a period, that's understatement. There is a large history of, how should I put it? Persecution of Old Believers in Russia. And there are several saints that belong to the Old Believer faith because of that discrimination and persecution. These would have been carried, they would have been hung on the walls. This is an archpriest cross that I did clean, and that's why it's so lovely and shiny. So this is actually an Old Believer cross, and I believe it's either 1300s or 1400s. And you can, it's kind of obvious. Not only is there a lot of discoloration and tarnish, but there's also high wear. This originally had an image of Christ on the cross in the middle, but a lot of that detail is worn away, and there's writing here that can barely be seen. For one thing, whenever they were cast, there wasn't, the technology didn't allow for much detail, but also they were rubbed and used over time. So a lot of the loss of detail can come from that. This particular object, it was told to us whenever it came to our collection, was whenever the last royal family of Imperial Russia, the Nicholas II's family, whenever their remains were found, I believe in the 80s, there was a large investigation to try to verify that it was in fact them, and that included a lot of research that was pretty difficult to accomplish at that time. So it was a long process, and the detective who was in charge of the investigation kept this cross with the bodies of with the remains of the family throughout the investigation until they could be reinterred. And all of the members of that family were canonized. So the fact that that religious items were kept with them when they were going through this very non-spiritual process, even after death, is very interesting and important. And there are a lot of faiths for whom that is important. These are more icons. These are some icons that are some of the smallest things you'll ever see. It's absolutely ridiculous. This is the head of St. John the Baptist. So even though there's minimal silver on some of these in their frames, ideally these will be wrapped in silver cloth once I can get them all processed. So these objects are not going to be stored this way. Ultimately, this is how they're being stored as they're being processed, as I'm reporting on their conditions, as we're judging whether or not any of them need conservation or any other kind of intervention. These are more icons in the form of triptychs. They could be set up around the house on small altars. They could be carried. Yeah, and we were really happy to have this collection come to us because we were lacking in the permanent collection, and not the permanent collection, in the Parker collection, we were lacking something in the way of icons. So having these icons as part of the collection, and part of how you can tell its age is that this is the structure of the back with these bars going across it. It fills a gap because these icons would have been a very integral part of Russian life, especially courtly life, with some of the quality of these. Because you can tell from, the wear on the ones I've already shown you, how important they were to the individuals. Here's the barely anything left.
What happened to that one?
What do you mean what happened?
Like in the bottom corner.
Oh, well, there's all kinds of things. I mean, there were candles burning a lot of times that were close by. I don't know if this was necessarily burned or if it was smoke that washed over time. I don't know if I cleaned this, if it would go away or not. There are a lot of objects that were around or being worn or being just in close contact with people while they were smoking indoors. So there's a lot of residue of tobacco smoke on things and so on. Yeah, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening to what some of my responsibilities are in the collection's care and management for the Parker Collection of Russian Art.